The cold marble of a courthouse floor is not a battlefield, but for a man who had survived war zones, it suddenly became one. He didn't carry a rifle, only a leather folder containing the evidence that could save a friend. He didn't wear his uniform, only the quiet dignity of a soldier who had bled on foreign soil for the very freedoms this building was meant to represent. But in the eyes of the law that day, his decades of service were invisible. His medals were meaningless. An officer's uniform saw not the content of his character, but the color of his skin. One violent shove was all it took to turn a decorated hero into a perceived threat. His body slammed to the ground in front of a crowd that chose silence. How does a man who fought for the flag end up treated like a criminal in its very shadow? Think about the courthouse in your own town, the flag flying over it, and ask yourself a hard question: who is truly being protected there? If this story makes you pause, help it find others by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more powerful narratives that demand to be heard. The air in the Fulton County Courthouse hallway was a stale cocktail, mixed from decades of old paper, cheap floor polish, and the low-grade institutional anxiety that seeped from the walls themselves. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat, a taste of muted desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed a weary, buzzing tune from high ceilings, casting a jaundiced glow on the scuffed marble floors. People moved through this light with their eyes fixed forward, their gaits ranging from a hurried scuttle to a soul-heavy shuffle. They shared a common language of avoidance, a practiced refusal to meet the gaze of strangers whose own simmering despair might prove contagious. On the hard wooden benches that lined the walls, shoulders were hunched and gazes were downcast, as if the sheer weight of the building's purpose was pressing them into a state of quiet surrender. Samuel Cross moved through this space like a ship cutting through a troubled sea. His back was straight, a ramrod of discipline that time had not bent, and his steps were the steady, measured cadence of a man who knew his destination and his purpose. He passed a young, flustered public defender, a man whose tie was already loosened, though the day had barely begun, trying to console a weeping woman. The lawyer's words were a low, urgent murmur, lost in the vastness of the hall, and he never once looked up from the file in his lap, his own exhaustion a shield against the endless tide of human sorrow. Samuel registered the scene with a practiced, dispassionate acknowledgement. Another small, contained storm in a building full of them, and continued on his path. He was 62, a black man whose face was a roadmap of distant suns and hard-won certainties. The lines around his eyes were etched by years of squinting into horizons most people would only ever see in movies. In his right hand, he carried a worn leather folder. It wasn't held loosely, it was stewarded. A piece of vital equipment whose contents, a sheaf of government-certified medical records, represented the last hope for his friend, David Hale, a fellow veteran, a brother forged in the crucible of combat, an amputee now fighting a new war against a bureaucracy that had deemed his sacrifice insufficient. This folder was the ammunition for that fight, and Samuel was here to deliver it. He arrived at courtroom 2B. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, and a uniformed figure filled the gap. Officer Kevin Malloy was a man in his mid-30s who wore his crisp blue uniform like a second skin, one he was immensely proud of. He stood with his arms crossed, his weight settled on one leg in a posture of casual ownership, a gatekeeper at a door he had been assigned to but now seemed to possess. As Samuel approached, Malloy's eyes did a slow, deliberate scan, from Samuel's plain gray coat down to his simple, polished shoes. It was not a look of assessment, but of categorization. Malloy's lips curled into a slight, unsmiling smirk. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked. The tone was not one of genuine inquiry. It was a note of light, practiced amusement, a soft-gloved challenge meant to disorient. Samuel's gaze remained steady. He stopped a respectful distance from the officer. "Yes, I am." The officer's smirk didn't waver. He shifted his weight, a subtle repositioning that made the barrier of his body more absolute. "This is a restricted area, sir. Official business only. You understand?" The "sir" was a pellet of ice, a word of respect used as a tool of condescension. My business is with the court, officer, Samuel explained, his voice a low, calm baritone that seemed to absorb the hallway's nervous energy. He did not react to the tone, only to the words. As per this document, he held up the folder, lifting it just enough for the official-looking subpoena stapled to the front to catch the light. The paper was a thin shield, but it was a shield of law. I was subpoenaed to testify in the Hale case. These documents are for the court. Officer Malloy's eyes flickered to the paper, but didn't truly read it. The gesture was a dismissal. He blocked Samuel's path as he made a slight move toward the clerk's window, visible inside the courtroom. Right. The court, Malloy said, his voice dripping with false understanding. Everyone's got business with the court. You can wait on the bench like everyone else. I'll let you know if you're needed. He was casting Samuel as a defendant, a loiterer, anyone but the witness the subpoena clearly stated he was. A profound stillness settled over Samuel. He had stood on the decks of warships in churning seas and on scorching foreign sands under the threat of unseen enemies. He knew the scent of misplaced authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his posture. I served 30 years in the United States Navy, he said, the statement offered not as a boast, but as a simple, irrefutable fact. I've stood in rooms where the rules were a matter of life and death. I will not be intimidated. He then calmly reiterated his purpose, refusing to be sidetracked. My instructions were to deliver these records to the clerk of court directly before the hearing begins. Those are the instructions I intend to follow. The brief mention of his service, the quiet refusal to be herded, seemed to flip a switch behind Officer Malloy's eyes. The lazy amusement vanished, replaced by something cold and hard. The facade of professional courtesy disintegrated, revealing the raw contempt beneath. His jaw tightened, and he took a half step forward, closing the remaining distance between them. The air grew thin. Malloy's voice dropped, losing its mocking lilt and becoming a flatly dangerous thing. Then you should know what happens when people don't follow protocol. His eyes were like chips of stone. You got 2 seconds to back up and move before I make you. The 2 seconds hung in the air, thick and heavy. Samuel did not step back. He did not step forward. He simply held his ground, his gaze unwavering against the coiled fury in Officer Malloy's face. Instead of meeting the threat with one of his own, he chose to make one final, quiet appeal. Not to the officer's mercy, but to the simple truth of the situation. His voice remained a low, even baritone, not an accusation, but an undeniable statement of fact, placing the weight of the escalating confrontation squarely on the man who was creating it. I haven't broken any law, Samuel said. You're the one blocking justice now. That was all it took. The word justice was the spark on dry tinder. For Officer Malloy, it was a final, unforgivable challenge to his authority. With a guttural sound of pure frustration, he lunged forward. It wasn't a push, it was an assault. Both hands, stiff and unyielding, slammed into Samuel's chest with explosive force. The first sensation was not pain, but a sudden, violent expulsion of air from his lungs. For a single, disorienting microsecond, as his feet left the ground, Samuel's world inverted. The polished gleam of the marble floor became the sun-bleached dust of a foreign land, and the scent of floor polish was replaced by the phantom smell of cordite, the muscle memory of being under attack. A cold and familiar companion from a lifetime ago, flared bright and hot. The shock was not born from the violence itself, but from its context, that it was happening not in a war zone, but in a hall of American law. He hit the ground with a sickening, solid thud. A sharp, radiating pain bloomed in his ribs, but decades of discipline swallowed the sound before it could form. His left palm scraped hard against the unforgiving floor. The leather folder, torn from his grasp, flew open in midair. Its contents, a life documented in diagnoses and appeals, scattered like a flock of startled birds. The papers glided and spun across the cold marble. One page, a psychiatric evaluation detailing the precise architecture of David Hale's post-traumatic stress, slid to a stop directly beside the expensive, wing-tipped shoes of a man in a tailored suit. The man's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before he pointedly took a half step away, his body language a clear vote for non-involvement. Into the stunned silence that followed the impact, a new sound emerged. It wasn't loud. It was a clear, piercing whisper that cut through the hallway's muffled tension more effectively than a shout ever could. "Why did that man push him, Mama?" A young boy, no older than 7, was tugging on his mother's coat, his eyes wide and fixed on the scene. His mother's immediate reaction was instinctual and swift. She pulled him close, her hand covering the side of his face as if to shield him from the sight, her other finger pressing firmly to her own lips. It was a universal gesture of silencing, an act both protective of her son's innocence and complicit in the hallway's collective refusal to see what had just happened. On the floor, Samuel began to move, slowly, methodically. He started to gather the scattered papers. A thin, bright line of red welled up along his palm where the skin had been torn, but he seemed not to notice. His mind was unnaturally calm, a quiet space honed by years of navigating crisis. He was not thinking of the radiating pain in his side or the sting in his hand. He was not thinking of the humiliation. He was thinking of David. He was focusing on the simple, mechanical task of fingers closing on paper, each document feeling impossibly heavy with the weight of his friend's future. They will not lose this, he thought, his resolve a silent, unbreakable shield. Not like this. From across the room, a new voice tore through the quiet. "That's the man who pulled me out of gunfire in Kandahar." It was David Hale, his voice raw with anguish, straining against the confines of his wheelchair. He was shouting like a man trying to wake a building full of people, pretending not to smell the smoke. Officer Malloy stood over Samuel, unmoving. He offered no help. He showed no remorse. His chest was puffed slightly, his expression a mask of defiant justification. He was an immovable object of institutional power, watching the man he had just felled. Samuel gathered the last piece of paper, placing it carefully back into the worn folder. Using a nearby bench for leverage, he pushed himself to his feet. He did not look at his bleeding hand. He did not look at the shocked faces in the hall. He looked directly at Officer Malloy. His eyes were calm, but they held the weight of 1,000 storms. He had been hit harder. He spoke, his voice low but carrying across the silent space. But not for trying to do the right thing. Samuel's words fell into the quiet hall like stones into a still pond, the ripples of their meaning washing over the smug certainty on Officer Malloy's face. For the first time, the officer's dominance wavered. His mouth opened, a retort forming on his lips as he searched for a way to reclaim his authority, to re-establish control. But before any sound could escape, a new presence commanded the hallway's attention. The heavy oak door of courtroom 2B swung fully open, and a figure robed in black stepped through, carrying with him the cold, rarefied air of ultimate power. The judge was a tall, white-haired man whose black robe seemed to repel the hallway's dust and desperation. His movements were precise, economical, and utterly devoid of wasted energy. His eyes, pale blue and surrounded by a fine web of wrinkles, swept the scene before him. It was a practiced, professional glance, the kind a man develops after presiding over countless dramas, both tragic and mundane. His gaze passed over the trembling mother and her wide-eyed child, over David Hale's rigid posture in his wheelchair, and over Samuel Cross, standing tall with a bleeding palm and a folder of scattered truth at his feet. In the judge's mind, this was not a scene of assault or a violation of civil rights. He registered the tableau as a disruption, an untidy, emotional element that was delaying the morning's proceedings. The man on the floor, or rather, the man now standing where he shouldn't be, was an anomaly, a piece of grit in the otherwise smooth machinery of his orderly domain. Justice, to the judge, was a matter of docket numbers and procedural correctness, and this raw human messiness was an inconvenience. Having assessed and dismissed the situation in under 3 seconds, the judge's gaze settled on Officer Malloy. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of commendation or even of communication. It was an affirmation of the status quo. It was the system validating its agent, a silent signal that order had been maintained and that it was time to move on. He then turned and proceeded toward the bench within, his robes flowing silently behind him, acting as if the entire incident had never occurred. The nod was all Officer Malloy needed. The flicker of consternation on his face vanished, replaced by a renewed, smug confidence. The system had his back. He turned to Samuel, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer. "See?" he said, his voice a low, condescending murmur. "We keep things moving here. You should have just listened." Samuel's posture, already straight, seemed to harden further. The judge's cold indifference was a heavier blow than the physical shove, a deeper, more profound violation. But he showed no reaction, his face a mask of resolute dignity. He turned his attention to the papers still on the floor. Before he could bend to retrieve them, a small, hesitant figure moved into his periphery. It was a young female clerk, her name tag reading Sarah. Her hands were trembling as she knelt, her movements quick and furtive, as if she were afraid of being seen. She began to gather the documents, her fingers fumbling slightly. Her fear was not abstract, it was personal. She recognized the specific look of cold authority in Officer Malloy's eyes. It was the same look a different officer had given her own younger brother during a traffic stop a year ago. A look that had preceded a nightmare of false accusations and legal fees. Her small act of help was a quiet rebellion against that memory. She avoided looking at either Samuel or Malloy, focusing only on the scattered pages. From a bench 20 feet away, Chloe Jackson watched the entire sequence unfold, a law student at Morehouse. This was her first time observing a real civil case, an assignment meant to bridge the gap between textbook theory and living practice. She had not expected the bridge to be a scene of such raw, casual brutality. Her thumb hovered over the record button on her phone, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could hear her constitutional law professor's voice, a dry but insistent baritone, echoing in her mind. The law is not what is written in books. It is what happens in hallways. It is who is seen and who is ignored. That thought, that single resonant sentence, was the premise that finally pushed her thumb down. The small red light on her screen blinked on, a silent witness. As Sarah the clerk handed the collected papers back to Samuel, Officer Malloy took a step closer. He saw the clerk's defiance. He saw Chloe's phone angled slightly downward, and he needed to have the final word, to reassert his dominance one last time. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, almost conversational tone, a choice that made the slur all the more venomous. "Sit down, boy." The word, thick with a history of degradation, landed in the charged silence. Samuel froze for a single, sharp intake of breath. He did not look at Malloy. He did not flinch. He simply paused his motion of straightening the papers in his hand. Then, with deliberate, almost unnerving calm, he resumed his task, his focus absolute. Samuel's silent refusal to react, his denial to even acknowledge the word or the man who spoke it, was a profound act of defiance. It stripped the insult of its intended power, leaving it to hang, ugly and exposed, echoing far louder in the tense hallway than any angry response ever could. The silence stretched, growing heavier and more profound with each passing second. Samuel Cross had finished straightening his papers, his movements economical and sure. He now held the worn leather folder against his chest, a shield of truth. The gazes of the few bystanders in the hallway remained locked on the quiet standoff, a morbid fascination mixed with a palpable desire to be anywhere else. Some shifted uncomfortably on the hard benches. Officer Malloy, his final verbal volley having met a wall of impenetrable dignity, seemed momentarily adrift, uncertain of his next move in a confrontation that had spiraled beyond his control. Just then, the narrative focus of the hallway seemed to pivot. It panned away from the raw, central conflict at the courtroom door, drifting over the stunned faces of the onlookers, and settled in the second row of the public gallery inside. Two men in dark gray suits sat there, observers to a drama they had not anticipated. One of them, an older man with a ramrod-straight posture that civilian life had failed to soften, and a full head of white hair, had watched the entire incident unfold. His face was a mask of controlled neutrality, but his eyes, a clear and piercing blue, were fixed on the scene with a searing, analytical intensity. The man sitting next to him, another lawyer by the look of his tired suit and overflowing briefcase, leaned in close, his voice a nervous, urgent whisper. "James, don't!" he hissed, his eyes flicking nervously toward Officer Malloy. "It's not our fight." The older man, James Langley, turned his head slowly. He didn't speak. He simply looked at his colleague. And in that look was a depth of profound, glacial disappointment that made the lawyer physically recoil as if struck. The unspoken rebuke was absolute. Having dismissed the whispered counsel of cowardice, Langley turned his attention back to the hallway. His decision was made. A faint scraping sound echoed in the unnaturally quiet room as James Langley pushed his chair back. He rose to his full height. He didn't just stand up, he ascended, his body unfolding with a practiced, ingrained discipline. The movement was not one of protest but of purpose, as if he had been called to attention by a silent, internal command. In that moment, he wasn't in a stuffy Atlanta courthouse. His mind was miles and years away. He could feel the phantom weight of a man on his back, a dead weight of broken bone and bleeding flesh. He could hear the ragged, desperate sound of breathing in his ear, a counterpoint to the sharp crack of enemy fire. He could feel the grit of Kandahar sand in his teeth and the stubborn, quiet, almost insane refusal of the man carrying him to stop, to falter, to die. They will not erase that man, he thought, a cold, hard certainty solidifying in his soul. I will not allow it. His voice, when it came, cut through the oppressive silence like a blade. It was not a shout, but it possessed a quality of command that resonated in the bones, a voice accustomed to being obeyed across chaotic battlefields and sterile briefing rooms alike. "That man," he said, his voice clear and unshakable, "is Samuel Cross." Head snapped in his direction, eyes widened. Officer Malloy, who had just begun to regain his footing, flinched as if the words themselves were a physical impact. As Langley continued to speak, a small muscle along Malloy's jaw began to twitch, a frantic, uncontrollable signal of his composure shattering. He was being confronted by a code he did not understand, by a form of authority that did not come from a badge, but from a place he could not comprehend. He led SEAL Team 6 into Kandahar. Langley's voice rang out, each word a carefully placed stone, building a fortress of truth around Samuel. He carried 3 wounded men on his back under enemy fire. He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the judge, who now sat frozen on the bench. Then he added, his voice softening with the gravity of personal history. "One of them was me." Langley took a step forward, out of the gallery and into the same space where Samuel stood. "He earned respect," the general continued, his voice now a low, powerful indictment of the scene they had all witnessed, "with blood and silence. And he never once asked for applause." That he was drawing a line, separating the superficial authority of uniforms and gavels from the profound authority of character and sacrifice. He stopped a few feet from Samuel. The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a movement that was crisp, precise, and utterly devoid of theatricality, Major General James Langley raised his right hand to his brow and delivered a perfect, formal military salute. The gesture was a silent thunderclap. It created a new jurisdiction in the stained marble hallway, a sovereign space where the petty rules of courthouse procedure were nullified and replaced by the unwritten laws of honor. In this new court, the general was the ranking officer, And the quiet, bleeding black man before him was the figure of highest distinction. The air in the room changed. The tense, fearful silence transformed, becoming thick with a palpable mixture of shame and awe. The lawyer who had whispered, "Don't," now stared at his hands. His face flushed. The mother who had silenced her son now looked at Samuel with a dawning, horrified respect. A profound recalibration of status was occurring, and everyone could feel it. Langley let his arm fall, the salute complete. His gaze swept from Samuel to the stunned faces of the onlookers in the gallery. His voice was quiet, but it carried the unshakable force of a verdict. "You want to talk about dignity in this courtroom?" he said, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Start by looking at the man who's still standing after you kicked him down." The silence General Langley left behind was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from the hallway. No one spoke. The legal proceedings for David Hale's case, once the central purpose of the day, were now a forgotten footnote, utterly shattered by a display of truth that no legal argument could match. The judge, his face a pale and rigid mask, banged his gavel once, a hollow, perfunctory sound, and declared the session adjourned. People began to file out of the courtroom, not with the usual post-session chatter, but in a heavy, contemplative quiet. Each person was lost in their own thoughts, processing the moral recalibration they had just witnessed. Lost within that crowd, Chloe Jackson clutched her phone. The smooth plastic and glass device felt impossibly heavy in her hand, no longer a simple tool for communication, but a vessel carrying a fragile, explosive truth. She slipped out of the courthouse, her mind racing, the stark images she had captured, the shove, the scattered papers, the child's question, the general's salute replaying in a relentless, high-definition loop. That night, in the cramped quiet of her small off-campus apartment, the silence was different. It was not the shared, stunned silence of the courthouse, but a solitary one, thick with the weight of decision. The city lights cast long shadows across her textbooks. She sat hunched over her laptop, watching the video for what must have been the dozenth time. The raw footage was even more jarring on the small screen. She paused the video and zoomed in, finding her own reflection in the polished marble floor of the recording, a distorted, wide-eyed ghost watching the scene unfold from the periphery. A wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. It was the physical manifestation of the moral burden she now carried. This recording was not just a data point for a class project anymore. It was evidence, a testimony, and it belonged to her. Her thumb hovered over the share button on a social media platform. What were the consequences? For herself? For the stoic man in the gray coat? For the officer whose face was a mask of contempt? With a surge of uncertainty, she closed the laptop. She picked up her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She sent the video file to her older sister, a seasoned journalist working in New York, with a single desperate text message. "What do I do with this?" The reply was almost instantaneous, a beacon of professional clarity in her sea of doubt. "You let it see the light of day, Chloe. That's the only thing you can do." The words were a release. The decision was no longer just hers. It was a professional imperative, an act of journalistic faith. She opened her laptop again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She dragged the file to the upload window. She didn't add a title. She didn't write a description. She let the raw file name, Mauve 8827 MP4, stand on its own. The lack of context, she decided, would be its strength. The truth required no embellishment. She took a deep breath and clicked the button. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Then, a single share, then 5, then 100. The video, with its undeniable sequence of events, Samuel being thrown to the ground, the child's innocent question, the general's thunderous salute, began to move through the digital ether. Within the hour, it was a raging fire. By nightfall, it had crossed 1 million views. By midnight, it had doubled. Headlines began to race across news feeds, each outlet scrambling to frame the narrative. War hero assaulted in Atlanta courthouse. Decorated veteran attacked by officer before testifying. SEAL Team 6 leader thrown to the ground in viral video. The words were different, but the core story was the same. A shocking tale of disrespect and violence. Soon, the response evolved beyond media reports. Veterans, from all corners of the country, began posting their own videos, seated in living rooms and workshops, some in uniform, some in wheelchairs. They spoke with a raw, unified voice. They spoke not only of Samuel, but of their own quiet struggles, of the feeling of being erased or forgotten by the very country they had served. The story had found its tribe. In the endless scroll of comments below one of the news articles, a user wrote, "I don't care what the context was. That man is a hero. We have to stand with Samuel." Someone else copied the phrase. Another added a hash symbol. A new organism was born, an accidental, organic rallying cry. It began to spread, multiplying with every share, every post, every expression of outrage and support. A hashtag, Stand with Samuel, had emerged from the digital noise and was now trending nationwide. The hashtag, Stand with Samuel, was not just a trend, it was a signal. Like a digital wildfire, it blazed across networks, illuminating discussions in newsrooms all over the country. Television producers, seeing the tidal wave of public engagement and raw emotion, understood that this was no longer a mere viral video. It had become a major national story, a cultural moment that demanded a credible, high-profile voice to anchor it. They scrambled to book the one man, besides Samuel Cross himself, who stood at the center of the video's most powerful moment. The invitation was sent out overnight. The next morning, Major General James Langley sat in a cold, quiet television studio in Washington, D.C. He wore a simple dark suit, the only adornment a small American flag pin on his lapel. He faced the polished, professionally empathetic news anchor with the same unshakable composure he had shown in the courthouse. The anchor, after playing the now infamous clip for her national audience, turned to him, her expression a well-practiced mask of solemn concern. "General," she began, her voice smooth and measured, "you were there. That salute was one of the most powerful things many of us have ever seen. What was going through your mind?" General Langley did not look at the monitor or the anchor. He looked directly into the camera lens, as if speaking to every living room, every VFW hall, every barracks in the country. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a debt. "I wasn't thinking about a salute," he said, his words precise and devastating. "I was thinking that we owe him, and we failed him." He paused, letting the simple, terrible truth of it land. America gave that man medals for his service, but on that courtroom floor, they treated him like a trespasser. I was in Fallujah when a sniper's bullet shattered my femur. I was bleeding out in an alleyway, taking on fire from 3 directions. Samuel Cross, under direct orders to fall back, ignored them. He threw me over his shoulder and ran through 100 yards of open ground while his own leg was bleeding from shrapnel. "That man," the general concluded, his voice hardening with a cold, righteous fury, "carried me on his back, and this country let a man with a badge throw him to the ground." His testimony was a thunderclap that echoed across the nation. Hours later, the National Veterans Council, a powerful and historically cautious organization, issued an open letter addressed directly to the governor of Georgia. Its title, printed in a bold, uncompromising font that filled the top of the page, read, "When silence is betrayal, we demand accountability." The letter was a formal, institutional validation of the public's outrage, a sign that the pillars of the establishment were beginning to tremble. At Morehouse College in Atlanta, in the hushed, book-lined halls of the law library, a group of young, Black students were gathered around a single laptop. The stark images of the courthouse video reflected in their wide eyes. The air was thick with a mixture of scholarly analysis and personal pain. "Look at the judges in action," one said, pointing at the screen. That's a clear dereliction of judicial duty to maintain order and protect a witness. Another shook his head, his voice low with emotion. It's more than that, he said, looking at his friends. This isn't a case study anymore. This is our hallway. This is our father. This is every black man who is told he doesn't belong in a space he helped build. A consensus formed, not through a vote, but through a shared, unspoken understanding. Their anger would not be limited to discussion. It would be transformed into action. That afternoon, they began organizing a nationwide letter-writing campaign, mobilizing law students from across the country to flood the Justice Department with formal requests for a federal investigation. The digital outcry was now manifesting in the physical world. On the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, a crowd began to gather. It started with a handful of veterans, old men in faded service caps holding simple, hand-painted signs. They were soon joined by dozens more, then hundreds. Civilians arrived, young and old, black and white, their faces a mixture of sorrow and resolve. They held signs that read, "He fought for you, now fight for him." At the front of the resolute, quiet crowd sat David Hale in his wheelchair. The sign he held aloft was a simple piece of cardboard, but the words painted on it, "He saved my life," were written in thick, trembling strokes that conveyed a fury and loyalty deeper than any printed slogan could. Then came the leak, an anonymous document, a scanned copy of an internal affairs file, appeared on a small whistleblower website. Within minutes, it was in the hands of journalists. It was Officer Kevin Malloy's disciplinary record. At least 5 prior complaints of racial bias and excessive force, 3 of them from other black veterans. Each one had been investigated internally. Each one had been dismissed. The file was a damning paper trail, irrefutable proof that Malloy's actions were not an aberration, but a pattern his department had repeatedly chosen to ignore. In downtown Atlanta, on the side of a large brick building overlooking a busy intersection, a new kind of response was taking shape. A group of veteran artists, funded by a flurry of small online donations, had commissioned a mural. They worked through the day and into the night, the bright beams of their projector cutting through the darkness. The design was a powerful diptych. On the left, it showed a young, uniformed Samuel Cross, his face grim with determination, carrying a wounded soldier through smoke and fire. On the right, it depicted an older Samuel, blood on his hand, kneeling to pick up scattered papers on a cold marble floor. The 2 images were a heartbreaking study in contrast, a visual testament to the nation's promise and its failure. And through all of it, the roaring media coverage, the official demands, the protests, the damning leaks, the creation of public art in his name, Samuel Cross himself remained silent. He gave no interviews. He released no statements. He did not appear on the courthouse steps. His silence was a profound counterpoint to the noise he had generated, a quiet center in a swirling hurricane of national outrage. The storm was made of millions of smaller moments. In a quiet suburban home in Los Angeles, a father watched the evening news with his teenage son. The clip of General Langley's salute played again. "You see that, son?" the father said, pointing at the screen. "A general saluting a non-com. You almost never see that." "Why?" the son asked. "What's it mean?" "It means rank doesn't matter," the father explained, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "It means what that man did on a battlefield was so profound. It transcends every rule in that building. It's the highest form of respect one soldier can give another." Miles away, in a dimly lit garage in rural Ohio, another man watched the same stories on a small, dusty tablet propped up on his workbench. He sat in an old Army issue wheelchair, a prosthetic leg leaning against a nearby tool chest. He opened the camera app on his tablet, his hands calloused and strong, trembling slightly. He didn't speak of heroism or battle. He spoke of something quieter. "Sam Cross," he began, his voice raspy but clear, "taught me how to play chess on a deployment. Said a battlefield was just a board with higher stakes. Taught me how to think 3 moves ahead." He looked away from the camera for a moment, his eyes distant. He looked back, his gaze firm. That man on the floor, he's always 3 moves ahead. He knew what he was doing. The millions of individual voices, the father in his living room, the veteran in his garage, the activists on campus, and the thousands of ordinary citizens online, had merged into a deafening chorus that the institutions of power could no longer afford to ignore. The pressure, once an intangible matter of public opinion, now began to exert a real, tangible force on the gears of the system. The Atlanta Police Department, which had maintained a stoic, defensive silence throughout the initial storm, now found itself at the epicenter of a national firestorm. With Officer Malloy's disciplinary record leaked and public outrage showing no signs of diminishing, their wall of institutional silence crumbled. They were forced to act. A terse, formally worded press release was issued. The Atlanta Internal Affairs Division had officially opened a case into the conduct of Officer Kevin Malloy. Citing the viral video and the extraordinary volume of public complaints, it was a reactive, not proactive measure, a decision born not of a sudden commitment to justice, but of a desperate need for damage control. Inside the precinct, the decision sent ripples through the ranks. In the stale air of the third-floor break room, an older officer named Frank, a man whose weary eyes had seen 3 decades of the city's troubles, watched the news report on his phone. A younger officer, full of the unshakable certainty that often accompanies inexperience, looked over his shoulder at the screen. "Come on, Frank," the young cop scoffed, stirring his coffee. "You see the way the guy was refusing to move? He was non-compliant. Malloy just restored order. That's all. The media's blowing it up." Frank didn't look up from his phone. He took a slow sip of his own coffee, the silence stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, devoid of emotion. "The man he restored order on has a Medal of Honor," he said, still staring at the screen. "I looked him up." He finally lifted his tired eyes to meet the younger officer's gaze. "What do you have?" "A commendation for writing parking tickets." The pressure was not just internal. Outside the Fulton County Courthouse, the daily protest had evolved. It was larger now, more organized, and noticeably more diverse. The core group of veterans in their faded caps remained, but they were now joined by nurses in scrubs on their lunch breaks, teachers holding signs demanding dignity and justice, and throngs of college students chanting quietly. The air was not one of rage, but of resolute, unyielding purpose. And then, one afternoon, Samuel Cross returned. He did not join the protesters. He did not speak to the news crews that swarmed him the moment he was recognized. He simply walked, with the same steady, deliberate pace as before, up the courthouse steps and through the main doors. He was there to observe the proceedings in David Hale's case, which had resumed under the glare of intense public scrutiny. His presence alone was a powerful statement. As he walked down the familiar hallway, a hush fell. People stopped talking and turned to watch. He was no longer an anonymous man in a gray coat. He was a living symbol. Some people nodded their heads in a gesture of deep respect. Others quickly looked away, their faces tinged with a shame that was new and uncomfortable. As he found an empty spot on a bench in the back row of the courtroom, a uniformed bailiff, a man whose face was usually a professional mask of stern neutrality, walked over. Samuel had seen the man there the day of the assault. The bailiff did not speak. He did not make eye contact. He simply placed a small, unopened bottle of water on the bench next to Samuel, turned, and walked away. The gesture was tiny, almost invisible, but it was a profound crack in the wall of institutional indifference. It was a silent apology, a quiet acknowledgement of a shared humanity. He sat there for an hour, a silent observer, his stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging outside in his name. During a recess and as he stood in the hallway, Chloe Jackson approached him. Emboldened by the impact of the video she had released, she felt a responsibility to understand the man at its center. Her voice was low, almost pleading. "Mr. Cross," she began, "the whole country is talking. They're waiting to hear from you. Why won't you say anything? Samuel turned to her. His eyes were not angry or accusatory. They were calm and held a deep, weary wisdom. He looked at the young woman who had, knowingly or not, changed the course of his life. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice soft, as if he were teaching rather than defending. I did speak, he said simply. In the way I got up, the line Huck in its perfect, simple clarity was more powerful than a 1,000-word press release. Chloe shared it with her sister, the journalist, who quoted it in her next article. From there, it exploded. The sentence became a new rallying cry for the movement. It began appearing on protest signs, scrawled in marker on cardboard. I did speak in the way I got up. It was quoted on news broadcasts and shared across every corner of the internet, a perfect encapsulation of dignified resistance. The ripple effects of Samuel's quiet stand, now amplified by his own words, traveled farther than anyone could have anticipated. The pressure continued to build, moving from the city to the state, and finally, to the nation's capital. 1 week after his return to the courthouse, a formal cream-colored envelope arrived by courier at David Hale's small apartment where Samuel was staying. It was embossed with the official seal of the United States Senate. Inside, a letter, printed on heavy official stationery, formally requested the presence of Mr. Samuel Cross at a special bicameral hearing on the subjects of veterans' rights and racial discrimination within the justice system. The local incident in an Atlanta hallway had now officially become a matter of national legislative importance. The invitation from the Senate was not a request. It was a summons wrapped in formal deference. After a long, quiet deliberation with David, his friend's quiet resolve mirroring his own, Samuel accepted. The news of the special hearing immediately became the nation's focal point, setting a date for the formal confrontation that everyone now awaited. Weeks passed in a flurry of national anticipation and careful preparation. Now, in a stately, wood-paneled hearing room in Washington, D.C., the air was thick with a tension that felt even heavier than it had in the Atlanta courthouse hallway. This was a different kind of power. It was not the arbitrary, street-level authority of a single officer, but the immense structural power of the United States government. The room was a theater of solemn importance, polished mahogany tables stretched in long lines, reflecting the soft, respectful light from the chandeliers above. Behind the elevated dais, 2 enormous American flags stood like silent, silken sentinels. The gallery was filled to capacity. In the front rows sat decorated veterans, their uniforms adorned with ribbons that told stories of service and sacrifice. Behind them were young, earnest cadets from West Point and Annapolis, their faces a study in rapt attention. The back of the room was a solid wall of news media. A dozen cameras on tripods formed a firing line of lenses, their small red recording lights like a row of unblinking, predatory eyes, all focused on the solitary figure seated at the witness table. The committee chairman, a stern-faced senator with a reputation for impartiality, called the hearing to order. After a brief opening statement, he spoke. The committee would now like to call its first witness, Ms. Chloe Jackson. Chloe walked from her seat in the gallery to the podium. Her steps were steady, her quiet determination a stark contrast to the nervous energy she'd felt in her apartment weeks ago. She was no longer just a student. She was a witness in the historical record. She was sworn in. Ms. Jackson, the chairman said, his voice resonating through the room's speakers. You were present at the Fulton County Courthouse on the day of the incident. You recorded certain events on your personal device. Will you please present that recording to the committee? Yes, Senator, Chloe replied, her voice clear. She placed her phone on a small dock connected to the room's large display screens. With a trembling thumb, she pressed play. There was no music, no narration, no editing. There was only the raw, undeniable truth. The cavernous, silent hearing room was suddenly filled with the echoing sounds of the courthouse hallway. The first image was that of Samuel Cross, standing his ground. Then, the brutal, jarring motion of Officer Malloy's shove. The sound of Samuel's body hitting the marble floor was a dull, sickening thud that made several people in the gallery flinch. The papers, his friend's entire case, flew like scattered leaves. David Hale's distant, anguished shout, "That's the man who pulled me out of gunfire in Kandahar," echoed with a new, tragic clarity. And then, the sound that seemed to silence every heart in the room, the small, piercing whisper of a child. "Why did that man push him, Mama?" When the video ended, the silence it left behind was absolute. The committee members stared at the blank screens, their faces grim. The reporters in the back had stopped typing. It was as if everyone in the room had collectively held their breath and forgotten to release it. The chairman cleared his throat. "The committee calls Mr. David Hale." David wheeled himself to the witness microphone. He adjusted his position, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair, his gaze fixed on the senators before him. He spoke, his voice low but filled with a fierce, protective loyalty. "I lost my leg in Kandahar," he began, "but I should have lost my life." He paused, swallowing hard. "The air tasted like copper and fear. The only thing I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the snap of bullets hitting the wall next to my head. I couldn't feel my leg anymore. I knew I was done. I was ready to be done." His eyes drifted to Samuel, who sat listening, his expression unreadable. Then there was his face, Sam's face. He wasn't yelling orders. He wasn't panicked. He just looked at me and said, "Arna, we're not done yet." "David." And I believed him. David's gaze hardened. He looked back at the committee. In that courthouse hallway, they tried to make him done. They tried to treat a man who walked through fire like he was a trespasser in his own country. They don't know the man they're dealing with. After David finished, a new figure approached the podium, the city's defense lawyer, a sharp, impeccably dressed man whose job was to mitigate the damage. The chairman gave him the floor. The lawyer turned his attention to Samuel. "Mr. Cross," the lawyer began, his tone reasonable, almost gentle. "First, on behalf of the city, I want to express my deepest respect for your service. We are all indebted to you." He let the placating words settle before continuing. "You are a highly trained soldier. You've operated in some of the most high-stress environments on Earth. That is an incredible testament to your fortitude." He paused. "Given that training, is it not possible, Mr. Cross, that in that stressful moment in the hallway, you perceived Officer Malloy's professional, authoritative tone as more aggressive than it was actually intended?" The question was a masterclass in subtle insinuation, an attempt to use Samuel's own strength against him by framing his perception as unreliable. Samuel Cross listened to the question without expression. A long, measured pause followed. He did not look at the lawyer. He looked at the senators on the dais. When he spoke, his voice was the calmest it had been all day. It was the voice of an expert witness stating an incontrovertible fact. "I am trained to differentiate between a threat and an authority," Samuel said, his words clean and precise. "A threat seeks to dominate through fear. An authority seeks to maintain order through respect. I am also trained to recognize an abuse of power when I see it." He finally turned his eyes to the lawyer, and they held no anger, only an unbreakable certainty. There was no confusion in that hallway. The lawyer stood speechless, his line of questioning dismantled with surgical precision. He mumbled a quiet, "No further questions, Mr. Chairman." The chairman nodded, then turned his full attention to Samuel. "Mr. Cross, do you have a statement you would like to make to this committee?" Samuel stood up. He did not need to adjust the microphone. He looked out, not just at the committee, but at everyone, at the veterans, the cadets, the cameras, at the nation watching him. He held the worn leather folder in his hands. "I bled for this flag," he said, his voice deep and clear, resonating with a quiet power that filled the vast room. He was not speaking of the small cut on his hand, but of a lifetime of sacrifices made in distant lands. I did not do it for your approval. I did not do it for your comfort. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the powerful faces before him. I did it for something bigger. He lifted his chin, his eyes holding the weight of his conviction. Justice. His calm, simple word landed with the force of a verdict, and the room was once again plunged into a profound, reverent silence. The silence in the hearing room held, reverent and profound, stretching for a long moment after Samuel's final word. The chairman on the dais allowed the weight of justice to settle, to permeate the consciousness of every person present. Finally, he cleared his throat, the sound a decisive break in the solemn atmosphere. The focus of the entire room, a palpable, collective shift of attention, pivoted from Samuel Cross to the table where Officer Kevin Malloy sat beside his union representative. The portion of the hearing for testimony was over. The portion for accountability had just begun. Officer Malloy, the chairman said, his voice a flat, impartial instrument of procedure. You have heard the testimony presented here today. You have seen the video evidence. Does you or your counsel wish to make a statement in your defense? Every eye in the room, including the cold glass eyes of the television cameras, was now fixed on the officer. The weight of that scrutiny was a physical force, pressing down on him. Kevin Malloy looked up, his face ashen. The defiant smirk he had worn in the courthouse hallway was a distant memory, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of disbelief. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Malloy seemed not to hear. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a single, sharp, unvoiced breath came out. No words followed. There was nothing to say. The evidence of his own actions, stripped of context and power, had left him utterly defenseless. The chairman waited a respectful 5 seconds before nodding to the presiding officer of the committee, a stoic congresswoman. She leaned into her microphone, her voice firm and clear, delivering the first verdict of the day. Given the irrefutable evidence presented and the witness testimony, this committee recommends the immediate suspension of Officer Kevin Malloy from the Atlanta Police Department, pending the conclusion of a formal and transparent investigation into his conduct. The words landed with the force of a gavel strike. As the official announcement was made, Kevin Malloy stared at a fixed spot on the polished floor. The last vestiges of color drained from his face. He could feel the hundreds of gazes on him, not as an officer of the law, but as something else entirely, a man publicly and irrevocably stripped of his power. The easy swagger that had defined his presence was gone, evaporated into the sterile, unforgiving air of the hearing room. In its place was a frightening, hollow emptiness, the system he had so confidently weaponized. The blue wall he had assumed would always protect him had just abandoned him under the brightest lights in the country. But the reckoning was not yet complete. Before a murmur could even ripple through the stunned gallery, another figure stood and approached the podium. She was a calm, unassuming woman in her 60s, a senior official from the Federal Judicial Ethics Office. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, yet it carried an immense, unshakable weight that commanded the room's absolute attention. She did not look at the disgraced officer. Her gaze was directed toward the front row, where the judge from the Atlanta courthouse sat among the invited observers. In light of the evidence, which clearly shows a violation of a citizen's rights occurring in the direct presence of a judicial officer, she began, her tone one of calm, clinical disappointment. Our office has been compelled to act. A formal inquiry has been requested regarding the presiding judge's inaction in the face of said misconduct. The integrity of the bench cannot be maintained if it chooses to be blind to the injustices that occur in its own shadow. The judge from Atlanta blinked, as if he'd been slapped with a truth he had long tried to unsee. His authority, absolute in his own courtroom, was now being publicly challenged on a national stage. He looked down at his own hands, resting on his knees. His gavel, the symbol of his power, was miles away in his silent courtroom. But even if it were in his hand, he seemed to realize now it would be useless against this tide. He was stunned into a thick, suffocating silence. his own inaction now the subject of its own formal judgment. The chairman finally spoke. "This hearing is adjourned." No one applauded. No one cheered. The mood was not one of triumph, but of a somber, necessary correction. As if on some invisible signal, the gallery began to rise as Samuel Cross stood from the witness table. He did not look relieved or victorious. He simply looked resolved. He picked up his worn leather folder and turned to leave. As he walked down the center aisle toward the exit, a remarkable thing happened. People stood as he passed. In the front row, the decorated veterans, men with decades of service in their eyes, rose to their feet and rendered crisp, silent salutes. The young cadets behind them followed suit, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning understanding. Further back, ordinary citizens simply stood in quiet reverence, their silent respect a more powerful tribute than any applause. They were acknowledging that what they had just witnessed was more than a hearing. It was the beginning of justice. The echoes of the hearing in Washington eventually faded, as all news cycles do, replaced by new outrages and new headlines. The formal investigations into Officer Malloy and the judge began their slow, bureaucratic crawl. For the world, the story seemed to have reached its conclusion. But for Samuel Cross, the journey required a different kind of ending, one that was quieter and more personal. Months later, as the crisp autumn air began to strip the leaves from the trees in Georgia, he returned to the only place he could truly measure the cost of it all, a place of memory and peace. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of profound quiet that lets the world breathe. A gentle wind rustled the remaining gold and crimson leaves, their dry whispers a soft chorus against the rows of silent, white stones. Samuel walked with his steady, familiar pace, each footfall pressing softly against the damp earth as if he were afraid to wake the past. In his hands, he carried a simple bouquet of white lilies, their stems wrapped in plain brown paper. He stopped at a grave marked by a flat granite stone, engraved with two names. Beneath them, a single phrase was carved deep into the stone: "She healed where others broke." He knelt slowly, his knees stiff from old wounds that never quite left him, and laid the flowers down with both hands. His fingers lingered on the cold stone, tracing the letters of her name, an act of memory and love. He could almost hear her voice, not in his ears, but in the deepest part of his soul. He thought about what she would have said about all of it. She wouldn't have praised his strength or his defiance. She would have taken his bleeding hand in hers, her touch gentle but firm, and said, with that knowing look in her eyes, "The cost of dignity is always high, Samuel, but it's always worth paying." The soft crunch of gravel announced a visitor. David Hale approached, guiding his wheelchair carefully over the uneven path. He stopped beside Samuel, the silence between them comfortable and deep, a language forged in the shared experience of things that could never be fully spoken. Balanced on David's lap was a carefully folded American flag, its 13 folds crisp and tight, the blue field of stars resting on top like a final, silent salute. He leaned forward and gently placed the flag beside the lilies. "For the man who saved me twice," David said. His voice a low murmur, meant only for Samuel and the quiet ground. Once in Kandahar and once in a courtroom. A few months later, a different kind of tribute was unveiled on the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse. There was no marching band, no grand speeches from politicians. A small crowd gathered in the cool morning air to see the bronze statue that now occupied the space. It was not a monument to a towering, imposing hero. The artist had captured something quieter, something truer. The statue depicted Samuel Cross as he had been that day, seated on a bench, the leather folder resting on his lap, his gaze fixed steady and ahead. The artist, a veteran himself, had struggled for weeks with the expression. He finally found it after watching the viral video countless times, focusing not on the fall, but on the moment Samuel began to rise. The look on his face in that instant was not one of anger or of pain. It was pure, unshakable resolve. That was the look now immortalized in bronze. The small, polished plaque at its base was simple and direct. It read, "He stood without shouting. He moved the world." The young boy from the courthouse was there with his mother. He stood before the statue for a long time, his head tilted back. He tugged on his mother's coat. "Mom," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "That's him." He looked from the bronze face back to his mother. "One day," he said, his voice soft but certain, "I want to be like him." The story concluded in moments like these. It lived on in the quiet understanding in a child's eyes, in the new training protocols being implemented at the police academy, and in the way people in the courthouse hallways now seem to look at each other with a little more care. Samuel's quiet, dignified stand had created a lasting impact, forcing a system to confront its failings and reminding a nation that the loudest voices do not always speak the most profound truths. Weeks later, Chloe Jackson found Samuel sitting on a bench near the courthouse, not far from his own bronze likeness. She sat down beside him, the silence comfortable between them for a few moments. "Your silence," she finally said, her voice filled with a question she had wanted to ask for months. "It was the loudest thing in the end. Did you know it would be?" Samuel watched a group of children on a school trip pointing at the statue, their teacher talking to them in low tones. He considered Chloe's question, his gaze distant. When he answered, his voice was calm and reflective, the voice of a man who had taken the full measure of his own actions. "I didn't think about loud or quiet," he said. "I thought about what was right." He looked at Chloe, his eyes holding the simple, hard-won wisdom of his life. "In war, you learn that sometimes the most important ground you can hold is the few inches you're standing on." His gaze drifted back to the courthouse steps, to the spot where he had fallen and risen. It was the same in that hallway.